Okay, so you are going through your first SOC 2 audit, and you're asking yourself, well, what does a good SOC 2 audit even look like? What should I expect? Well, the first thing you have to consider is not all SOC 2 audits are the same. You can have two completely different companies. They have clean reports, and one of those audits can still be weak. So what should you really look for? How do you know what a good SOC 2 audit should look like? So the first thing a lot of people assume incorrectly is that a SOC 2 audit is pass or fail. And that's really not the case. The SOC 2 examination is not pass or fail. So if it's not pass or fail, then what is it? So what you first have to understand is a SOC 2 examination and ultimately a SOC 2 report. The auditor is going to issue an opinion. The opinion can be unqualified or it can be qualified. So generally speaking, a clean opinion refers to unqualified. So for a type 2 examination, there are actually three opinions that the auditor presents. One is the same as the type 1. Is the system description presented fairly? 2, were those controls designed and implemented? And then the third opinion, which is specific for the type 2, is did these controls actually operate effectively during the examination period? And the lens that we're looking through is, did those controls operate effectively to achieve the relevant trust services criteria or the relevant criteria? So bringing this back, a clean opinion does not necessarily mean the organization has strong controls. It just means those controls operated effectively throughout a period of time to demonstrate achievement of the relevant trust services criteria. I think another misconception is that if an unqualified opinion is clean, then a qualified opinion must be dirty or unclean. And that's, again, not the case. So all that a qualified opinion means is that except for a particular criteria, which is called out in the opinion paragraph or the basis for qualified opinion paragraph, except for that, everything operated effectively. Except for this particular criteria, all of these controls operated effectively throughout the period to demonstrate that the relative or the relevant criteria was met. So it doesn't mean that the service organization failed. It just means, all that it means is that except for that one criteria, everything passed, right? Everything was operating effectively to achieve the criteria, except for this particular criteria. So I think a lot of service organizations get nervous because they view a SOC 2 examination as pass or failure, and that's really not the case at all. So generally speaking, an audit, specifically a SOC 2 examination, is really broken into three main phases. There's the planning phase, the execution phase, and the reporting phase. So during the planning phase, you really want to be having conversations with your auditor. It is a partnership. You really want to be working with an auditor who is coming alongside of you and explaining things so that you fully understand them. And so that all happens really beginning with the planning phase. So you want to be having very clear scoping discussions. What systems are included? What systems are not included? What are the physical locations that are included? What physical locations are excluded? What are the critical vendors? If you're using a third-party infrastructure provider like AWS or Microsoft Azure, those should be included. You want to be looking at, well, what services do we, as the service organization, want to include in our SOC 2 report? You want to have real conversations with the auditor and make sure that the auditor is asking thoughtful questions. Why are you including this service? Why is this service not included? I went to your website and I noted you provided 4 services. We're only including 2. Is that correct? And making sure that those scoping decisions are made collaboratively. Another important part of scoping is to ensure that you are aligned on the actual controls that are going to be audited in the SOC 2 examination. So then the thing to keep in mind here is SOC 2 is not a security framework at all. There are no prescriptive controls. It's not like other security frameworks like PCI or HITRUST, where there are very prescriptive controls that the organization has to be operating. SOC 2 is actually a reporting framework. So while the criteria is prescribed, each organization brings their own controls to the audit, and it's those controls that the auditor is going to test and validate that they have operated effectively. They've been designed, they've been implemented, and they've operated effectively. So a lot of organizations will come up with those controls on their own, and there are specific design attributes that I'll do another video on. But suffice to say that in order for the controls to be considered designed effectively, so a control has to have 4 design attributes. Who is performing the control? What is being performed? When is it being performed? And how is that control being documented, or what is the source of record? A lot of organizations may choose to use a GRC platform, and those GRC platforms will have sort of generic templated controls. But the expectation is the organization is not just going to take those controls and say all of these controls are applicable, because they may not all be applicable. So you have to go through, the organization has to go through and read those controls, determine if they are appropriate or if changes need to be made. So a lot of times the GRC platforms will have a generic control that says something like, the company performs employee performance evaluations. And I think we all get what that control is saying or trying to say, but there are some design elements that are missing. So for example, the company doesn't perform those performance evaluations. Usually it's someone in HR or a performance manager. And those performance evaluations are performed on an annual basis, or maybe sometimes semi-annually or quarterly. But if you just take the control out of the platform that says the company performs performance evaluations, that's not really helpful to the auditor, and the auditor can't actually test that control because it's missing the who, whether it's the performance manager, HR, or whoever, and the auditor doesn't know when that control is supposed to operate. So part of that planning discussion with the auditor is going through and aligning on all of the controls that the auditor is going to audit. So that could be 60 controls, 80 controls, 120 controls. That needs to all happen during the planning session. I always use the analogy, it's kind of like the foundation of a house, right? It's literally the part of the house that you're never going to see and you're going to take for granted, but it needs to be flat and level and plumb, because literally the entire structure of the house is going to be built on top of the foundation. That's basically your base level of controls. You want to make sure that your controls reflect reality, right? So if a control says the HR manager performs performance evaluations at least quarterly, and during the planning discussion with the auditor, you're going through the control and the auditor's saying, okay, is this control performed quarterly? And you say, oh no, actually we move that to annually. Well, you need to make an adjustment to that foundation. You don't want to start building the walls and the ceilings of the rest of the house based upon the performance evaluation being performed quarterly when it's actually performed annually. So all of that happens during the planning phase. And the next phase of the audit is the actual execution phase. And this is, I would say, most often, thought of it as the actual audit. This is when the auditor is going to be requesting evidence. The service organization is going to be providing that evidence or providing documentation. The auditor is going to be performing the testing and then concluding on the actual test. So in the execution phase, that's really the audit, if you will, or when people say, oh, we're going through an audit, they generally mean that they are in the execution phase. The audit has been scoped, the controls have been agreed upon, and now the auditor is actually testing those controls. They've provided you with a request list that relates to every single one of those controls. You've provided audit evidence or documentation showing or proving that this control is operated effectively or did what it was supposed to do during the period. And then the auditor is going to look at that evidence to reach a conclusion on whether or not that control was operating effectively during the period. So they may request samples, depending on the type of test. It could be a sample of one, a test of one, or multiple samples. And so they will test each of those controls and then ultimately reach a conclusion. The conclusion could be there were no exceptions noted, or there were exceptions noted. Controls operate black and white. So either they operated or they didn't. So either the performance evaluation was performed or it wasn't. And if it wasn't, then the auditor has to note that as an exception. It doesn't matter if the performance evaluation was performed one day after it was supposed to. Again, it's black and white. If the performance evaluation was supposed to be completed annually, that is once every 365 days. And so if the performance evaluation was completed on day 366, that is an exception. The auditor will apply professional judgment to determine if a report should be qualified based upon an exception. But the auditor is not going to make a judgment on whether or not to report an exception. So then the last phase is the reporting phase. And so it's not like a courtroom drama where the auditor is going to hold back this information and then he's going to reveal the report to you and there's going to be all these exceptions and it's going to be qualified. That's not how it works. So during the reporting phase, the auditor is going to give you a draft of the report. And in the draft of the report, it's going to have the auditor's preliminary findings. And so if you see exceptions in the report, hopefully those have been discussed even well before you even got the draft of the report. But the purpose of sending the client the draft of the report is to make sure that the client agrees with the presentation of the report and all of the testing results. Ultimately, if there are exceptions in the report, management has the opportunity to provide management responses, perhaps explaining why the performance evaluation was not completed annually. So then once you have reviewed the draft, you've provided comments back or you've made updates, then the auditor is going to take those final changes, roll them into the final report, and then ultimately what they will do is they will send you a management representation letter. We can cover that in a different video, and then ultimately package the report up and then distribute to the service organization. So if that's what you can expect on a normal SOC 2 examination, then what are some indicators of a weak SOC 2 audit? So as I mentioned in the beginning, during the planning phase, we're laying the foundation of this audit by identifying the key controls or the relevant controls. And so if an auditor basically dismisses those controls and over relies on templated controls, that should be a warning flag. You should say, stop, time out. These are not my controls. These don't match to the controls that are actually in place at my organization. The auditor completely dismissed your actual controls and they just tested the canned controls, probably from the GRC platform. So that's indicative of a weak audit. The auditor didn't even test your controls. They just used some generic templated controls that may not even be relevant to you. So I think the second thing that is indicative of a weak audit is when the auditor does not actually look at evidence. They rely on inquiry alone. They just interview you and they ask you, did you do tell me about the performance evaluations that you do. Did you do them? Okay, that sounds good, right? But you haven't actually provided any substantive evidence to the auditor is just relying on inquiry alone, or they're relying on just a policy. This is the policy that HR has. Okay, great. Sounds good. Well, how does that actually show those performance evaluations actually happened? It doesn't. But there are auditors and firms that just rely on testing a policy. I think a third indicator of a weak audit would be a lack of communication. Your auditor should be checking in at least once a week. They should be having phone calls with you. They should be hopping on video calls. They should be interacting. If the auditor is just asking for evidence, you give the evidence, and you never hear from the auditor until the end of the audit, I would ask, well, what's going on? Access to the auditor is going to be very important because it is a highly collaborative process. So I know this is a ton of information, and you're probably wondering, oh my gosh, Ryan, why does all of this matter? And the reality is it matters because there are stakeholders that are relying on the quality and the content of this report and the thoroughness of the report. You could have investors that are relying on your SOC 2 examination. Your customers could rely on your SOC 2 examination. Your customers' auditors are going to rely on the information. It's the assurance that is driving the trust of that report. And so if the audit is improperly scoped, it has generic controls. Those generic controls were inappropriately tested through inquiry only or just relying on a policy document, and you have investors and customers and executives all relying on it, well, they are being misled. So you have all of these stakeholders, both current customers, prospective customers, that are relying on the structural integrity of your SOC 2 examination report. So hopefully that provides you with additional clarity on what a good SOC 2 examination looks like, and provided you with some insight on attributes and elements of a bad SOC 2 examination, or at the very least, a SOC 2 examination that's maybe not performed according to the standards and is not as trustworthy. If you found this content helpful, consider giving the video a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel. I publish new content each week focused on SOC 2, audit quality, and practical GRC leadership insights designed specifically for practitioners and compliance professionals. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.